Hey, good evening, David. This is Ken out in the Heartland. And so these were my notes on your proposed module for storytelling as world making. And without trying to comment on your area of expertise in narrative and story, I thought I'd uh, just present some ideas in my response as a function of futuring and scenario planning, which is the area where I have expertise. Because a lot of what you're talking about reminded me of the challenge of trying to forecast different futures from a status quo. And you're talking about three potential futures, one of the turning, one of what I thought of as the status quo future or an evolution of the current path, and then the collapse. Hopefully, it'd be a phoenix, but something where we are rebooting from scratch because of the disaster that's embedded. And the main idea was that there are these three possible futures that the story, the storytelling creates a world that is internally logical and consistent. And when we think about that in the world of strategy making and scenario planning, we do that because there are so many possible future states that you can't itemize them all and then make a rational utility model to choose between them on the basis of a weighted multi-criteria decision model or something like that. But in fact, you have to create representative futures that are good samples of possible future worlds that are broad enough that you feel like you've covered a reasonable set of possible futures, so you're not cherry picking or you're not limited by initial imagination, but where they're also different enough from each other that there's a distinction that makes a difference in between them, so that there are real choices. And we understand that there are other possible stories, an infinite number of stories, and gradations in between, but that these represent clear and distinct and unique, complete, logical views of the future. And when we're doing that in the world of scenario planning and strategic forecasting, we set criteria so that when we generate these futures, we can evaluate to see if we've done what we're supposed to do. And that is, are these really unique, self-contained, internally consistent? What are the features that make these future stories separate and plausible and possible true visions of the future? If we've done that, then we can start analyzing them on the basis of different values and different weighted values. We can say, why do I favor this, or why do I favor that, or how does my choice of strategy unfold in each of these three possible futures? So in that sense, storytelling as world making is all about generating possible futures. And so you've shown the left and right limits of the turning, which I think of as the revolution that is won by the good and the virtuous. Something like a status quo future, which represents an evolutionary path where we're not really surprised that the powers that be remain the powers that be, and there's some unfolding and continued development, but along predictable paths that makes a strong connection between the current status quo and that future status quo, where little of significance changes with the basic dimensions of the current state of nature. And then the collapse, a reboot from scratch. So as I was thinking my way through that, it occurred to me that when we do that initial assessment of where we are, we really have a series of possible stories or a coming together of individual stories, a collective sense making from our shared stories in that story circle. And the image that came to my mind was the story circle with the infinity sign contained in the middle, representing that genuinely anything is possible when true stories come together, and when we leave the story circle and we embark on these different pathways towards these possible worlds of future making, that in fact that those are contained inside the seeds that are created in that story circle. I want to acknowledge and remember the power of the status quo. That it has this funny feature that nobody is really satisfied with it except those power elites that are really benefiting from the current structures and power arrangements, but that everybody else is just about equally miserable and marginally satisfied. So even if you don't have everything you want, you can at least look around and say, well, nobody else is doing that much better than me, so I guess we're kind of all in this together, and there's an equal misery index among most people, except for those poor people down at the bottom who we can discount because they deserve that, or whatever sense making we've bought into that's been implanted by the powers that be to keep us marginally satisfied with the status quo. But the status quo, although most people really don't like it, we got to remember that it does actually represent something like a powerful trade-off between many different competing interests that have been separated and kept isolated by the structures of power, so that it may be simmering, but it's still contained within this cooking pot of the status quo. And that has a real power to it that we sometimes fail to acknowledge. Well, we might analyze that status quo using your elements of story and the elements of true storytelling, those principles. I'm not going to itemize those, but things like themes, actors, agents, structures, forces, cultures that are the direct actors and players in this setting, but which also have deep history and roots and issues. And so if these represent the branches, the external nameable manifestations of the current power structures, it is connected to those deep roots that are the source of much of the power that informs the status quo. It seems to me that when we're in that true story circle and we're starting to develop the elements of these different possible future worlds, that to be consistent and coherent and complete, that we probably identify essential variables from this mix that are going to allow us to explicitly build these representative future stories. And so you don't want to cherry pick and then pick the one that you want and then do lip service to the other ones, but you end up picking, 5 to 7 variables that are going to distinguish the future in meaningful ways, and then you array some mix of those that constitutes collectively this internally logically consistent world in which the story unfolds in a way that is believable and legit. It seems to me that then when we craft those stories and we think about how we get from the status quo to one of those future ones, that the path along the way has the elements of the story of the journey of heroes anyway, and that there are certain phases in these paths of progress or decay or collapse, that there might be signposts along the way. What are those signposts? What are the indicators that tell us which path that we're on? Is it possible that there are turning points and decision points along the way that you might start this way and find yourself going that way? Or is it really just one path, or is this a network of choices that unfold where we're inventing the story as we go? There's some dynamic element to this that accounts for the ecosystem itself changing as a response to the stories that are unfolding. So there is a dynamic living quality to this story, and that we might think of phases along the way that are like phases of plot or acts in the play or chapters of the story as it unfolds. And so any author that's developing a story has some sense that the story gets to vote about where it wants to go, and it tells you what comes next, despite that initial outline or feelings that you have about where it might go. A genuine, authentic, living story is its own participant. It's its own author. It has a voice as well. So we might ask ourselves that if we can define these end states that are self-contained, internally consistent, unique, and differentiable, what are the signposts along the way that tell us that we are on one path or the other? What's the difference along the way that makes a difference? This all reminded me of the idea of living story and living theory that Whitehead and McNiff talk about from the tradition of action research and education and nursing. Finally, at what point do we recognize the tipping point of irresistible momentum that says, oh, not only are we on the path towards that, but there's kind of no other way out of that. There is a converging and a rush of energy and predictability and inevitability about that once we've gotten to that tipping point. And so it seems to me that that's one of the important elements that distinguish these stories. It says, how do I know that I'm committed and I'm getting to that point? What is the tipping point, if there is one, that tells us that we're making that progress and we just got to endure and keep going? So it seems to me that walking man, those 5 ways of knowing that I've talked about before, head, heart, gut, hands, and feet, is part of this in some way, that rationally I can understand these pathways and outlines and roadmaps and my itinerary, my expected plot, the artist's vision of how that story is going to unfold, the muse that informs that, and that my heart certainly has a vote in which one of these that I want, that I'm going to work for, that I'm going to commit to, and the gut, which worries about the things that are going to happen along the way and the risks of failure, and why I might choose this because it's safer than going for this and then failing, that maybe I default back to this, which is how we got the status quo in the first place, is that all those choices that were risk informed and where we had feet of clay and we couldn't follow through, and we went with the default safer play and the seductive lure of the, hey, this is not really the status quo, it's going to be slightly better, and that promise is what causes you to go to the status quo future instead of really going for it in a bold vision that grabs that much brighter future, the seductive lure of, well, it'll just get a little bit better if we just keep the faith and try to incrementalize. That is that's a player in this that I don't know is reflected in the 3 choices you made, but that seems to me to be some element of the shadow that is worried from the gut, that talks about the fear and the risks of too great a change in too short a time, and who knows what might happen, and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that be safe, and tomorrow's another day, and incrementalize to the future. Don't boldly go, to El Dorado. And then the knowledge of our hands that tells us how to construct these and how to make the changes and how to do it, and then the knowledge of the feet, which how we endure on these long, difficult journeys that heroes pass. So head, heart, gut, hands, and feet seem to me to be contributing to the idea of these stories as they unfold and as we live them in practice, and not just from in our head because we can imagine it must be so. No, you've actually got to walk that path, and you got to walk the talk, and to be authentic and committed and have skin in the game. So those were some of the ideas that occurred to me as I went through your notes, and some ideas that come from these other disciplines like futuring and scenario planning and strategic development and living theory from action research, and again, inspired by some of the things that you've enlightened me on as we go. So yeah, and I really do feel the phenomenon of being in the story as you help it to emerge, that the participatory nature of these things, which gets me to that idea of the living story, which is connected to Whitehead and McNiff's living theory, is that you become part of this and you start walking that and rewriting our own Canterbury tales of a better future, tales of future past, the Moody Blues. Anyway, take good care. Thanks for your inspiring work, and whatever I can do to help you, just let me know.